Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Photography, a Tool for Conservation, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader and Pro Photographer Anthony Amsel. Thank you so much for being here today, Anthony. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Brooke. And hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. I am very excited to be able to share this webinar with everybody because I'm hoping that some of you will be inspired to grab your cameras, your smartphones, or anything in between and go out into nature, enjoy what life has to offer, and maybe contribute a little bit to conservation along the way. Now, without further ado, here we go. So of course, my name is Anthony Amsel. I am an expedition leader and photo expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventures. I have the very wonderful opportunity to work in lovely remote areas like the one pictured here in Greenland, of course, as well as Iceland, all the Churchill programs, as well as a few other things along the way. I also run trips outside of Natural Habitat Adventures, and all this has led me to be able to experience wonderful opportunities to work with wildlife, around wildlife, and interesting people along the way. I'm also very much a wildlife biologist, my very first passion, of course, being wildlife and animals. I wear many different hats, as you can see, but when it comes to wildlife biologists, my passions definitely lie with reptiles and amphibians like turtles, as well as marine mammals like whales and wonderful bears, which is why I love going back to Churchill every year to see our magnificent northern polar bears. And beyond that, of course, I am a photographer. It's kind of easy to throw a lens into your bag and to take it out whenever you're on a trip or in your backyard because you just get to snap away those memories. But more importantly, for the purposes of this webinar, of course, is the conservation behind that. Putting those three hats on the same day allows me to really kind of garner better appreciation for the work that goes into conservation from researchers, from academics, from educators, of course, but also from photographers. Now, a lot of you might be used to some names like Paul Nicklin and Christina Niedermeyer, for example, who work with Sea Legacy, and a lot of their photography goes towards public awareness, towards campaigns, and towards education. Today, we're not going to focus as much on that. Instead, we're going to look at a few different topics. We're going to look at uses and strategies behind photography for conservation. We're going to look at some case studies that are very immersive and, in my opinion, incredibly interesting. We're also going to look at the real world impacts of what it means to employ photography for conservation, because this goes beyond just looking at an image and being captivated by it. It very much has real world impacts on regional, municipal, and even federal levels. And then after that, we're going to take a little stroll together and see how you all can contribute, whether you're a novice photographer, whether you're a seasoned veteran behind the lens, and also look at some of the ethics behind wildlife photography, because it is very important, especially in this day and age, where everyone has a lens, whether it is a smartphone or a DSLR or a mirrorless. There are certain guidelines that we need to keep in mind, of course, when we do go out into nature to ensure that we're not disrupting the natural behaviors. All right, let's get into it. The first thing I would like to talk about is the use of photography for photo identification. And of all the animals on this planet, there is definitely one group that often comes to mind. Of course, we're talking about whales, like the beautiful humpback whale in this photograph that was diving in the waters of Iceland off the town of Ísafjörður, which is one of the beautiful places we go to with Natural Habitat Adventures. The humpback whale has become very much an emblem of conservation around the world, especially when it comes to the health of the ocean. They have a very interesting history. They were brought very much to the brink of extinction, with less than 1,000 individuals left in the world. And thankfully, today in 2025, there are now thousands and thousands of them roaming the waters across this planet. When it comes to photo identification, though, they do create a very interesting little case study, because their wonderful tail that you see pictured here actually acts as their fingerprint. Now, if you look at the back of the tail, there are a couple of different features here that you can see on your screen. We have the notch right in the middle, the trailing edge at the top, the leading edge on the bottom, and of course some unique markings. And we call this whole structure the fluke. So oftentimes we'll say the whale tail, but you'll often hear the fluke as well. Of course, the left edge of the fluke and the right edge of the fluke. Now, if you look at your own fingerprints, you'll probably see a couple of different markings, nothing like this whale here, but you'll see your fingerprints, maybe a scar from a childhood injury or from cutting a bagel open a few days ago, who knows? Whale tails and flukes have something very similar, and this is very much how you can identify them. Now, organizations around the world, including researchers, including conservationists, have been using flukes for a number of decades to identify whales in their region, but also around the world. What this has led to is an interesting catalog of these flukes. Now, every region around the world tends to have their own catalog. For example, this is the Marine and Freshwater Research Institute catalog that is based in Iceland. And of course, they have hundreds and hundreds of pictures that have actually been collected well from the 1980s until today. So we're talking well over 40 years. And these are categorized usually in 5 different categories. So we have full white, full black, and then the different types of coloration, always based off of the amount of black on the back of that fluke. Now, of course, we're talking about whales in Icelandic waters. And as I mentioned, there are catalogs all around the world, even in Antarctica, if you can believe it or not. Now, it becomes very easy to identify these beautiful whales based off of their flukes because they show their tails when they dive. The vast majority of the mass of this whale actually extends to the very front of the body. So they really have to get into a vertical position to be able to dive nice and deep into the waters of the ocean. However, not every whale does that every single time. In fact, there are many other species that don't often show their tails. One of them, for example, is the largest animal on our planet, the largest animal that has ever existed, the beautiful blue whale. Now, you don't necessarily have to go through every single text on this slide, but it is a very good example, however, of the different body parts that are used to identify whales other than their flukes, their tails. Of course, we have the dorsal fins on the very top. And as you can see, the blue whale, ironically enough, largest animal on the planet, has a relatively small dorsal fin for its size, but it can still be identified using that, as well as patterns on the top of its body, and as well as near the back of the head. There is another whale, the fin whale, very similar to the blue whale in nature and coloration. However, it has this distinguishing feature that is pointed out by the red arrow on your screen called the chevron, which actually has a V shape. And this is how most researchers and photographers will identify these whales. They'll take pictures of them, and then they will classify the chevron markings or other patterns or injuries to distinguish these individuals. This becomes really, really interesting because, of course, over time, sometimes you get rare occurrences. You get these whales that show up usually year after year because they come back from the migratory paths, sometimes from the tropics up north or the tropics down to Antarctica. And with this, you're able to see patterns that happen. You're able to see individuals come back. For example, in the St. Lawrence estuary, where Natural Habitat Ventures used to run trips, you had wonderful whales that would show up every single year and have been for the last 40 years. Locals knew them and even gave them names. Of course, from a scientific perspective, you'll have things like BP 133, which doesn't mean very much or sound very inviting. Zipper, on the other hand, is a nice name for a whale and one that has come back often. But sometimes you'll get weird anomalies. And in this slide, what you're seeing is not 3 different whales. This is actually all the same whale. It's just so big that it's hard to capture its entire body in one frame. But what's interesting about it is that this is a hybrid whale. It is a hybrid between a blue whale and a fin whale, an occurrence that does not happen very often. And the way that it was discovered was through observation, but more importantly, through photography. What you can see is the red arrow is pointing at the chevron on the front of the body of the whale. What's odd about it, though, is it has this bluish gray coloration. On the bottom image, which was actually taken last year in the St. Lawrence, under a different angle, under a different light, you can see how much more there is blue in the pigmentation of the skin of the whale. with the two first images being from 2012. Now, of course, you can only theorize that it's a hybrid, but what's amazing is that researchers were able to take a biopsy based off of the pictures that were taken. And again, a biopsy being a biological sample of the whale, and confirm that it was indeed a hybrid between these two species. So, of course, again, imagery here, photography being so important because it played a vital role in finding the movements and patterns of this whale to allow researchers to go and get a biopsy. Now, another wonderful and kind of famous creature that some people think is still very mythical is the narwhal. Of course, when we think about a narwhal, we think about that huge tusk. But in this particular situation, we're actually going to focus on the patterns on its back. So as you can see here, this is the same individual, photos taken year after year. And this is very much, again, in the St. Lawrence estuary on the east coast of Canada, very close to Montreal and Quebec City. And what we're seeing is that, of course, to the untrained eye, this might seem like any ordinary whale, very hard to distinguish. But again, this is where photography and imagery becomes so important, because you can see in the highlighted areas here, the patterns are very, very similar. You have that kind of ring on the top. There's this white little patch. And of course, again, this acts as a fingerprint for the whale, another way to kind of devise and determine that it is the same individual. This particular narwhal is a little famous actually in that area because it is very rare for a narwhal to actually be spotted in southern latitudes of the country. They are very much an Arctic species. So to have them down in the St. Lawrence estuary is unbelievable. And this is the only individual of that species that you will find in that area, at least at this time of the presentation. Who knows what the future holds, of course. But this is very much what researchers wanted to see. Is it the same whale, yes or no? And photography very much alluded to the fact that it is absolutely the same individual that has been coming back year after year. More striking on top of that is the fact that this narwhal has been adopted, quote unquote, by a wonderful little herd of belugas. What you're seeing here is this narwhal in the St. Lawrence estuary near the Saguenay Fjord that is swimming very much with a herd of other male belugas and has been doing this year after year after year. There is an organization out there called the GREM, which is a French organization that has been doing whale research for decades now. And they have been observing this particular individual for a very long time. Using imagery, they've been able to very much look at different patterns and different behaviors with it. One of them being the fact that it has been very much actively staying around this herd of belugas and even potentially courting females. So as we can see here, photography very much kind of piercing the veil of a realm of animals that we don't get to see very often, that in fact are very difficult to see in darker waters that we find in the north. Of course, this is in the tropics of the Caribbean. We can't just easily put cameras into the water because the water itself is so dark. So having imagery like this is incredibly, incredibly vital and very important to understanding the numbers of whales in a certain areas, figuring out if the whales are coming back year after year, and then seeing weird behaviors like this, for example, where you have this solo narwhal that is existing with belugas down in the southern parts of the country. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit because, of course, we just talked about the wonderful marine mammals that exist on our planet in our oceans. But there's another group of animals that is near and dear to my heart that I talked about very briefly at the beginning of the presentation. We're talking about reptiles. Believe it or not, Canada has a wide array of reptiles and amphibians, just like the wonderfully massive, almost prehistoric looking snapping turtle in this picture. Before being an expedition leader, I was very much involved with heavy field work in the southern and central parts of Ontario with the Saving Turtles at Risk Today project. I'm still very much involved with it behind the scenes, as well as the wonderful and dedicated conservationists who work with these unbelievable animals that have been around for over 100 million years. Now, unfortunately, reptiles, specifically turtles, in Canada are a species at risk. And there is one particular species that I have to say is not only adorably good looking, but also incredibly fun to work with because it allows us to use photography in a very different way. We're talking about the Blandings turtle. Now, many people ask me, why is it called the Blandings turtle? Well, let me tell you, there is once upon a time a gentleman by the name of Mr. Blanding who discovered this turtle, and well, he named it after himself. But as you can see, it has a beautiful yellow throat, and this photo has not been oversaturated. It has not been modified. This is very much what they look like in the wild. Males oftentimes have that very yellow throat. There's a lot of theories as to why. They also have a couple of distinguishing factors apart from just the yellow that you see on the throat and the front of the legs. Specifically, their backs, which we call the carapace, and more importantly, the plastron, which is the underbelly of the turtle. Now, we talked about whales, we talked about their flukes, we talked about the fingerprint. So you might see where I'm going with this, but Blandings turtles, their plastrons also very much act as a fingerprint. Every single Blandings turtle, when it is born, when it is a hatchling, it comes out of the egg, might have some kind of mishmash of a pattern, but as it grows, that pattern becomes more and more distinguishable and will last throughout its lifetime. So when we would go out into the field, we would find these beautiful, beautiful turtles. Here we are in a wetland, of course, with all of our equipment, measuring the turtles' heights with our little apparatus here. But beyond that, of course, we would take measurements, we would weigh them, sometimes we would take blood samples for a slew of different reasons. But more importantly, we would take pictures of them. Of course, to trace our efforts, to trace where we were, to see what our measurements were, but more importantly, to be able to identify each individual. Now, this project that's been going on, the Saving Turtles at Risk Today project, the START project, has been going on for a very long period of time, well over 10 years. It is one of the longest running research projects on turtles in the country of Canada, which means that there are a lot of different pictures. We're talking about hundreds of pictures of Blandings turtles, especially their plastrons. And someone wanted to understand if there was a way to identify these turtles using photo recognition software, because currently the usual way to identify these animals is through physical markings. So you would get the turtle and then you would put in little notches on the very edges of its carapace. And this can be translated into a numerical code. So you have basically a number. But as you can imagine, it's a very intrusive process. And if you're a turtle being shook with a file to be able to get a notch into your carapace, you're probably going to be a little unhappy. But more importantly, you're going to be losing a lot of energy because it is a very stressful and sometimes a very time consuming process. This isn't only done with Blandings turtles, it is a very natural thing that a lot of researchers do with different species of turtles. And for context here, this doesn't create any pain to the turtle. We never draw blood or anything like that. Think about filing your fingernail, for example. All you're really doing is removing some of that keratin. So we don't have the turtles bleed or anything like that. And of course, this process has gone under a massive amount of scrutiny to make sure that it is ethically responsible to do so. I do need to put that little nod there because, of course, we wouldn't do this if it brought any harm to the turtle. It does stress them out, of course, but there is no harm being done to them beyond maybe a little bit of a weird trip and then being released back into the wetlands, of course, because none of these turtles are kept into captivity. These are all wild turtles, and they are brought right back to the wetlands that they call home. However, of course, as we just said, very invasive, very intrusive. So the idea being, if we're able to take pictures of these beautiful turtles, is there a way that we can actually use any sort of software to identify them? And when you know it, a group of researchers decided to test this theory. So they took pictures from 5 different regions in the country, most of them from Ontario, but also from out east, Nova Scotia, that type of area as well. And what they did was they ran every single one of these turtle plastrons through a wonderful program, which highlighted the edges and contours of the plastrons, as well as looking at specific individual markings. And what you can see on the picture on the left-hand side of your screen, of course, is that software doing just that, recognizing multiple different points on the plastron of the turtle. On the right-hand side, what you can see is even a picture taken in 1998. We're talking about 27 years ago, if my math is correct. A black and white picture compared to a picture in 2002. As we can see, same turtle, same identifying markers. There doesn't seem to be any sort of scar tissue or injuries on this. So that plastron has very much been kept intact through natural ways, was able to be recognized by the software, which is an unbelievable thing. Because as you can see, you don't need to have the most high-tech equipment. Sometimes and oftentimes, all this is either just a compact camera or a smartphone, anything that has a relatively good resolution and that you're able to take clear pictures of. Now, what this study showed is that the software was actually able to identify these turtles on a really impressive level. In certain regions, there were some little nuances, because sometimes what will happen is a turtle will have either injuries that leave scar tissue, or for example, they'll have rust that actually grows on their plastron, which makes it a little bit more difficult to identify. But we're talking about identification of over 80% in most cases to be able to, at the very least, bring up a top three. So what that means is when you're in the field, you can pop up the software, you take your picture, you run it through the software, and you're very much able to find at the very least the top three turtles that might be this specific individual. And then you can just compare with your eyes to confirm what it is. Very, very impressive software, very impressive work. This team went through a very large amount of pictures to be able to figure that out. But the question is, what about the impacts? Of course, because that's something that we said we would talk about. In the case of turtles, photography can be really, really important, especially when it comes to visual surveys. This will allow researchers, conservationists, but also government bodies to know whether or not animals are in a certain location or not. And the best way to do that, of course, is with photography, because word of mouth, especially nowadays, is not enough. You very much need some sort of photographic evidence to know and to be certain that a certain animal was in a certain location, especially with what we call metadata, which very simply is data about, well, data. That metadata will tell you, for example, potentially exactly the GPS coordinates, as well as a slew of other information. Now, beyond visual surveys, of course, population dynamics, such an important thing. You want to know if the population of animals is healthy or not. By doing visual surveys, by photographing these animals, you can actually do certain things like a mark recapture study, where you are able to learn after a couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years, how that population seems to be doing in terms of growth. Sometimes they'll be decreasing, sometimes increasing based off of the individuals that you're catching. And where the photography becomes important, of course, is learning about those individuals. So what will happen is you'll go into a wetland, you'll catch some turtles, compare them with the pictures you took previously. And if you know it's the same individual, you mark that down. Or if it's a new individual, you also mark that down. And then you run that through some very complex formulas that I will not get into today, of course. But then you're able to really understand what's happening with that population. Beyond that, all of these things contribute to potentially creating protected areas. For example, in Ontario, as well as many places in Canada, if you find a species at risk, like a Blanding's turtle, oftentimes there's a buffer that is then created around that specific observation. And then if there was ever to be any development or anything along those lines, there would have to be, of course, many, many mitigation factors to ensure that you're not disturbing these animals or their habitat. Speaking of protected areas, connectivity is such an important thing as well. You might be able to protect a certain wetland, but these animals can actually travel quite far. Certain turtles can travel kilometers and miles to get from their wintering grounds to their summering grounds and even their nesting areas. So by having photography, by knowing where these animals are going and taking photographic evidence, you can increase protection for connectivity of these protected areas. And predation, which is not one that we see very often. However, turtles are subject to predation, believe it or not. Oftentimes, for example, there are populations of wood turtles that actually spend quite a bit of time on land. And unfortunately, raccoons have made their way into these more remote areas and will oftentimes predate these unfortunate turtles that can be relatively defenseless when they're outside of their shells. So all of that to say, when it comes to turtles, when it comes to whales, we can see that photography has a huge impact in terms of understanding where these animals are, which individuals they are. But now, of course, technology is very much changing and evolving very, very rapidly. We're actually able to use different types of programs, specifically something called photogrammetry, which is a word I've been practicing all week to be able to say it properly on a webinar. This is a technique that was actually developed in the 19th century by a French colonel who happened to be a geometry professor. And he discovered that it is very much possible to measure distances using photographs and landscapes. It isn't something I'm going to go into too much because it is very, very technical. And for the sake of time, if you want to read up on it, I highly encourage you to. It's a very interesting process. Today, however, in 2025, researchers use drones to be able to do this for a number of reasons. First of all, we talked about, of course, how photography on whales is so important using distinguishing features, but it can be limiting. For example, here on the right-hand side of your screen, you have, of course, this is all the same beluga, the same individual, but on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see how on the right and left flank, there are injuries, scarring of some sort, markings that happen to this individual. Now, depending on the angle that you're taking pictures from when you're on the boat, depending on the conditions, it can be more or less easy to get distinguished high resolution pictures. With a drone, however, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, the aerial view really allows you to garner a better perspective of this animal. You can see the whole body, you can clearly see those markings on the left and right flank. But when it comes to photogrammetry, what's also impressive is you can use the drone to be able to understand the actual size of this individual. So what will happen is researchers will launch their drone, just like the picture you see on this left-hand side, and that little arrow that you see, or rather big arrow, is pointing to a box, a square. That is a square of known dimensions. And when you take the ratio of those known dimensions and the pixels in the image that is being taken by the drone, you can actually overlay that with pictures of belugas and you can figure out what their body sizes are. Now, you can maybe kind of start putting some puzzle pieces together. We talked about photo identification. So if you're able to figure out your individuals and you can find those individuals week after week or month after month or year after year, and you can go and take pictures of them over time and see how their growth is doing, see if they're getting bigger or smaller, you can also see the health of these populations. So beyond just understanding how many whales are there, you can understand what's going on with the whales. And this would not normally be possible without imagery like this. Conventionally, the way that people would do it for whales specifically, as well as other marine mammals, they would have to go get a biopsy, which means driving in your boat as close as you can to a whale, taking either an arrow or something to grab a biological sample of this animal. You can understand that for many, many reasons, this is not necessarily the best and most efficient way of doing things. You're creating a very high stress situation for the animal. You're creating a high stress situation for the humans. There's a potential for injury, of course, when it comes to being close to an animal like this, especially bigger whales like blue whales. So by using drones, again, we're tuning into something that is very non-invasive. And then when you throw in a little bit of math, what you can actually do is beyond just figuring out the size of these animals, you can also kind of figure out what's happening in an internal component. So what we see here, of course, is a whole bunch of formulas, kind of makes us feel like we're back in high school. But what researchers have been able to do is come up with a formula where they basically dissect the dimensions of this animal into truncated cones, and they're able to calculate the volume of blubber, not only from, for example, this Weddell seal that you see here on your screen, but from whales as well, because overall they have very similar hydrodynamic body shapes, right? So as you can see, so far, imagery, amazing, has very, very real impacts when it comes to identifying certain individuals, when it comes to figuring out population dynamics, as well as figuring out all these what we call body condition indexes. So the overall health of the individual. Beyond this, beyond the biological side of things, there's also the ecological side of things in terms of behavior. We're going to tune back into whales very briefly here. We're going to talk about those belugas that we saw earlier on. The population of belugas in the St. Lawrence estuary is very possibly one of the most endangered populations on the planet. Overall, there are somewhere between 130 to 150,000 belugas across the planet. Again, just like narwhals, they are very much Arctic species. However, this particular population, the St. Lawrence population of belugas, counts less than 1,000. The numbers are getting better and better in terms of estimates, but we know that their numbers are declining. So understanding their behavior becomes incredibly important. And using photography, specifically in this case, drones, becomes one of those essential tools. Now, what you're seeing in your image, of course, we see the white belugas, but you also see these beautiful little gray beans. Those are juvenile and baby belugas. And specifically, what we're seeing in this image here is again the GREM, the Marine Mammal Research and Education Group in the St. Lawrence area, who were filming this group of belugas to figure out what was going on. What they were seeing was that the adults were babysitting these beautiful small gray belugas. They do lose that gray coloration and kind of end up with that beautiful ivory white over time. It does take a number of years, but when they are born, they are kind of a darker grayish color like this. And what the researchers wanted to understand more specifically was what was going on with this babysitting. What was happening with that? What are the group numbers like? What are the social structures like? So they started expanding their search in the area. And when I say the area, I specifically mean the St. Lawrence estuary. On this map, there's a lot of different areas, but it gives you an example of what we're talking about here. So if you look kind of in the middle of the screen, you'll see this town called Tadoussac, which is at a confluence between the Saguenay River, the St. Lawrence River, and the St. Lawrence Estuary. And back in 1988, there was, pardon me, 1988. I'm a biologist. I'm not a historian. Dates are hard for me. But there was a marine park that was created there. And we're not talking about a commercial marine park with fences and attractions. We're talking about a national marine conservation area that was founded by Parks Canada and the CEPAC, which is the Quebec Parks Association. And their main goal here was to protect belugas. It had this overflow effect, of course, of being able to protect other animals. But by looking and observing through photography, through drone footage, what they were able to see were the different locations where these belugas would go to rest, to raise their young. You have to keep in mind that this is also very much the St. Lawrence Seaway, an incredibly busy area when it comes to marine traffic, specifically with commercial vessels like whale watching vessels, but also more importantly, industrial vessels. We're talking about big tanker ships importing and exporting goods from North America to Europe and beyond. So you can see that there might be a conflict of interest here. You have this beautiful marine park that has protected areas, but you also have these belugas who very much are in waters with these very big, noisy, potentially fatal ships. So what was done was by combining the observations of these animals and of course federal and provincial regulations, they were able to close off certain areas, add restrictions, add the speed that you could go to ensure that animals weren't being hit, weren't being harassed, and weren't being disturbed. In the case of these belugas specifically, there's a wonderful little bay called Bay Sainte Marguerite that now is closed in the summer to all boating because what they realized was that this bay was incredibly essential to raising the young and being able to ensure a properly peaceful area. It is a relatively shallow bay because of the tides. So what we started seeing was that these belugas were going there and congregating in big numbers. In fact, in the fall, there's an event that happens, a wonderful phenomenon where you'll end up having dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of belugas in this wonderful little bay. And by closing it off to boat traffic, what we saw was these belugas starting to return more and more and more. And this would not have been possible without all of the observations, specifically from photography and from drone footage. So as we can see, these impacts are very real. Photography has its place to be able to ensure that on a federal level, regulations can come into play to protect not only these animals, but their habitats. And that habitat is so incredibly important. The park itself actually covers roughly 35% of the critical habitat for belugas. But again, through further investigation, further drone footage, further photography, and of course, research, what researchers and organizations realized was that that critical habitat actually had to be expanded to properly protect this critically endangered species. And with that, in 2025, so this year, there was an official announcement that was made that the Saguenay St. Lawrence Marine Park was actually going to expand to cover 100% of that critical habitat. It is a major push forward for these beautiful white whales. And again, a very large part of that thanks to photography and thanks to drone footage. Now we're going to switch gears a bit. Again, we went from marine environments to wetland environments. Now we're going to go towards something a little bit more terrestrial. Now, for anyone who's ever been on a NatHab adventure, there's a very good chance that you heard about a wonderful place called Churchill, which is here at the northern part of Manitoba. You can see it on the edge of Hudson Bay. And of course, if you have been to Churchill or you've heard of Churchill, you probably know where I'm going with this. Of course, we're going to be talking about polar bears. Now, I told you at the very beginning of this presentation, my three passions, reptiles and amphibians. So we had turtles, check. We talked about whales, check. And now we're going to talk about bears, because how can we not? They are magnificent, they are majestic, they are Arctic icons, but more importantly, they are also emblematic of what is going on with climate change and what is happening with their ecosystem. Now, the map you see on the right-hand side is Wapusk National Park. Wapusk is actually derived from a Cree word that means the white bear. So for all intents and purposes, we allude here, of course, to the greatest of all the white bears, the polar bear. Now, Wapusk National Park is beyond just being, a representation of polar bears, also one of the, if not most concentrated and most dense denning areas for these bears in the world. Now, when you go up to Churchill, it's very easy to get these lovely images. Of course, we're in their territory. We know where they are. That's why we go have these wonderful tours there. I'm actually very excited for this coming season. I know we're in spring, but I'm already thinking about the bears in the fall and hoping that they have had a very successful hunting season out on Hudson Bay. Now, when you come with us on our expeditions, of course, we're in these beautiful rovers, and it's so easy to take these pictures because, we're right in their migratory path. That's the beauty of Churchill, right in the path of polar bears. However, in Wapusk National Park and other remote areas, it becomes increasingly difficult to not only get out there because there are no roads, but beyond that, it gets very difficult to bring out equipment to constantly be out there, which is why a lot of researchers and organizations use a very different technique for gaining and bolstering images of polar bears and other animals. We're talking about camera traps, whether that happens to be a trail cam, like some of you may or may not use in your backyards, or camera traps that are set up on rocks like the image in the middle, or for example, in the tundra on the bottom right image, you can see it protected by all of these big rocks, because of course, bears, if that is the thing that you're trying to photograph, can be highly inquisitive, and they are very strong and powerful animals. You want to make sure your camera traps are properly set so they're not being jostled around. Now, there is a researcher from the University of Saskatchewan who wanted to understand and better gain perspective on how polar bears were using habitat in Wapusk National Park. Now, of course, this also interested the regulators of the park, of course, Parks Canada, and what they were able to see was, of course, polar bears. That is what you would expect to see. And between 2011 and 2017, this team actually documented 401 visits from not only polar bears, but two other species of bears. And this is where it gets very, very interesting. In the same region, their camera traps were able to gather pictures not only of polar bears, but also of black bears. And believe it or not, grizzly bears. So what we're seeing here is in the same area, not necessarily in the exact same location, but in the same area, we're seeing all three species of bears use the same region. There are certain trail cams that actually picked up polar bears and black bears using almost the exact same trail within a 3-hour period. None were, to my knowledge anyway, none were photographed in the exact same frame. But this goes to show that using remote photography equipment can allow you to see these beautiful moments and capture them. Of course, they aren't necessarily the most dazzling images in the world, but from a perspective of ecology and research, this is unbelievable to capture. People had theorized that grizzlies were in the area for a very long time, but they hadn't actually observed them with their bare eyes. So to be able to use these camera traps and to be able to confirm without a shadow of a doubt that these three species are in the same area not only is amazing in itself, but it also raises a lot of questions. What is happening to the ecosystem? What is going to happen with climate change? So it brings in a whole new kind of bracket of how to manage this area to allow these three bears to coexist over the course of the next few generations. Now, we know that historically, these three animals and these three species probably use very much the same territories in different parts of the world. However, it is very, very fun to be able to see them in the same place, of course, so close to home, at least in my case. And beyond that, of course, is just the amazing fact that these three animals are able to live in the same area without necessarily having to compete with each other, although these are questions that are trying to be answered more and more. Now, beyond bears, of course, when we think about the Arctic and we think about the tundra, what camera traps have also been able to do is allow for a better insight on the behavior of these animals, as well as, for example, this Arctic fox trying to predate some goose eggs, and those geese parents really putting up a fight to ensure that, of course, their hatchlings are safe. Or, for example, this caribou mother with her wonderful young one there just kind of grazing on the grass. So these camera traps really allow us to gain better perspectives in incredibly remote areas where either access is incredibly limited or bringing and hauling, a very big telescopic lens is very difficult to do. However, people have also been using these camera traps to gain beautiful images like the snow leopard in this top frame or the rhinoceros in this bottom frame. These are some of the photographs that actually won awards across the world for how beautiful they were. And of course, not easy places to get to. One of my favorites, of course, is this beautiful, beautiful bear that was captured at night with a camera trap. And again, camera traps, not necessarily just trail cameras, but also just can be high-end, beautiful equipment that you just set up on a timer. But of course, that requires a lot of money, and not everybody has that. So sometimes a trail cam is all you need. All right, folks, I hope you're still with me, because now we get to one of the parts which I'm very thrilled to share with you, which is citizen science and how you can get involved. Because of course, I've been talking about researchers, I've been talking about conservationists, expedition leaders, but not everybody fits in those brackets. So how can you get involved with this? Well, there's a couple of different ways. The first one is with Happy Whale, which doesn't sound real, but it is. It is an unbelievable program that was set up for anyone to use around the world. So whenever you're on a boat, whenever you're on shore, if there happens to be a whale around, grab your phones, grab your cameras, and try to get some pictures, because what you can do is add it to a growing database. And what you do is you submit your pictures of your, of course, marine mammal encounters as pictured here. And what will happen is the program and the organization will identify those whales based off of their markings. Of course, here we're using the markings of humpbacks because, of course, as I mentioned earlier, it is one of the easiest ways to identify those animals because those flukes are so distinct. And once those are matched, what happens is Happy Whale will actually track every observation around the world. And when the whale that you photographed, and this is the really fun part, when the whale that you photographed is found somewhere else, they will actually send you a ping to let you know that your whale has been found. It was actually really fun a few years ago when I was leading one of the trips in Quebec. One of our guests had taken a picture of a whale in the St. Lawrence, just with his iPhone. We were close enough that he was able to get a good picture. And then he wrote to me about a year and a half later, and he was so excited because his whale had actually been spotted down in the Caribbean. So it's a nice kind of little way to keep track and keep tabs on what's happening. But beyond this, it's incredibly important because it creates this beautiful network of observations around the world, and you can see migration patterns, you can see concentrations of whales, and you can understand how important that is for conservation. Now, we talked about the fluke. We keep talking about it because it's so easy, but if you want to, you can also get other types of pictures. You can get dorsal fins, like this beautiful orca that we saw on the Haida Gwaii expedition, beautiful sailing expedition. And not only can you see the dorsal the dorsal fin, you can also see this gray pattern on the bottom. We call it the saddle. And every orca pod, every member has a different type of saddle. This allows you very much to identify the individual, as well as that little scar that you can see on the dorsal fin. Unfortunately, injuries are something that are very easy to see. So, of course, if you do see an animal with an injury, get a picture of it. Not only will it help identify the animal, but might be used to garner more information about what's happening with ship collisions, what's happening with marine observations. And once you combine all of your observations. This was a screenshot that I took yesterday to give everybody an example of what is happening in the Happy Whale Network today. So we have over 1 million photos that have been submitted with a vast number of course, encounters. And as you can see, a very large amount of identified individuals. We're talking over 100,000 individual marine mammals. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what does, because I think this program is unbelievably cool. It is very user friendly to use. If you have any questions, you can always contact the support group. But now, of course, I realize that not everybody has the opportunity to get onto a boat into the middle of the ocean and go see whales, which is why there's another program called iNaturalist that you can use not only for marine mammals, but for literally every single living organism on this planet, whether it is a plant, whether it is a butterfly, a turtle, a bear, or even a fungus or lichen. You can take pictures of these living organisms and throw them into the database. And as you can see, there are observations all around the world, even right in the middle of Greenland in the center of your screen. Of course, these are not all my observations. I do not have the time to be able to put in over 200 million observations. These are observations that come from all across the world. But I really hopefully encourage you all to start using this program. It is a lot of fun to use. It is a community-based program. And when you put your observations in, they can be everything from live animals. They can just be sounds. For example, on the right-hand side, I put in the sound of some beautiful spring peepers that came out a few years ago. Unfortunately, it can also be dead animals. If you see a dead animal on the side of the road and you're not sure what it is, for example, like the Midland painted turtle you see on the bottom of that list, that was unfortunately struck by a car, you can also add that information in. And then what I love about this program is people are constantly and actively using it, and they will reinforce your observations. So when you take an observation, even if you're not completely certain of what it is, you'll put in the information and someone will come by, look at your image and confirm what it is or suggest what it might be. Now, we happen to be at a really interesting point in the year where it is the official 2025 City Nature Challenge, which technically, in terms of observations, closed yesterday, but this gives you a very brief kind of glimpse of how active this community is. So we're talking about, in the span of those few days, over 2 million observations from around the world, over 60,000 species. And the Reto Ciudad Naturaleza, pardon my Spanish, I know I butchered that, as you can see, are the top contributors with over 108,000 observations. What's great is over the course of the next few days, from today until May 4th, observers will be going through iNaturalist and looking at all of these observations, confirming what was found, identifying the species. And then on May 5th, we'll receive the results of all these beautiful things. It is such a nice way to contribute to citizen science and conservation, because researchers will use this data to be able not only to potentially discover new species, which has happened through iNaturalist, but also, again, looking at population dynamics, looking at the health of the ecosystem. I myself have used some of this data for turtle research. It is so incredibly important. And all it requires is literally just a phone, being able to submit your image, and that is about it. But of course, if you're going to go out into your backyard, into the backcountry, into the bush, or on an expedition, and you're going to take images of animals, we always have to think about photography ethos. So next few slides are just some of the guidelines to be able to think about how you're taking your pictures. Because when it comes down to it, you basically want to be a fly on the wall. The idea here is to take pictures of animals and really, really aim for natural behaviors. You never want to be changing the behavior of an animal to the point where it is doing something it wouldn't normally be doing. What I'm trying to say here is lower the amount of disturbance, of course, for these animals. In this scene, when I was in Uganda, this beautiful baby gorilla and its mom were just kind of napping and taking it easy. We were at a faraway distance that they were just, of course, just doing their natural thing. And that's really, really what you want to aim for. There are ways to be able to understand whether or not you are disturbing animals. One of them is learning animal behavior. In this picture, we have two polar bears, both from Churchill, both from last year. The one on the left-hand side, as you can see, is hunched over, has this look in its eye. Its ears are slightly tucked backwards. As we can probably surmise, this animal was unfortunately disturbed At the time, for context, we were very far away. Unfortunately, another operator came in and did not realize the bear was there. It happens. It's unfortunate. But of course, if you do see this type of behavior, you probably want to back off a little bit. Versus the bear on the right, just kind of enjoying and basking in the sun of the fall and just enjoying its time. There is no disturbance there. This is an animal that is very, very, very relaxed. The best way to do this, though, I mentioned it very quickly, give animals space. Unfortunately, in this picture, we see a beautiful juvenile spirit bear that that is very clearly stressed. Ears are very, very tucked back, looking right at the photographer who clearly should not have been in that spot. This bear has no exit path. There's no way it can easily get away from this person without being highly stressed. This is very much what you want to avoid when you're going out. Of course, you never want to bait or feed wildlife. Um, if you ask any photographer, they will hopefully tell you you should never be feeding wildlife to be able to take pictures of them or baiting. This sign is very much one that you will see when you come see polar bears and observe them in Churchill. It is out on the tundra, and it is a good reminder that we do not want to bait or feed bears or any wildlife for that matter. And if you're unsure about where you are, if you're unsure about what you're about to go see, consult the experts. This was Thomas, one of our conservation officers when we were in Uganda, who took us out and was very much an expert in the region. Of course, he has an antenna in his hand, and what he was doing was trying to figure out where the lions were so we could go have wonderful, respectful observations. Thanks to Thomas's help, we were able to find these beautiful lions and the leopard, very, very respectful observations and great photography that came out to it. And beyond that, of course, you want to be choosing responsible operators. You want to look into the operators you're going to be going with. I am so proud to work for NatHab because of the ethos of this company, because of the ethos of the local guides that we work with, as well as our own guidelines in terms of taking pictures and being in the, of course, habitat of these animals. You also want to be careful with locations. A lot of animals like this beautiful spotted turtle are species at risk and sometimes can be, unfortunately, under threat of poaching. So whenever you're sharing pictures, try not to share locations or exact locations. Stay nice and vague. One of the other ways that you can actually help is by donating your images. A lot of small grassroots organizations don't necessarily have the infrastructure or the capacity to take beautiful imagery. But of course, we all like seeing nice pictures. So for example, here we have a couple of pictures that were donated by different people to Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Canada, a wonderful organization. And we can just see how sometimes just donating your pictures can really revamp a website or anything like that. These aren't things we typically think about, but maybe you have a conservation organization in mind. Reach out to them, see if they need pictures. And the last one I have is one that I think is proper to every single person, which is try to build a story when you're going out there. It is one of the key things about conservation photography is compelling people to be more engaged, compelling people to really bolster conservation. By building a story with your photography, oftentimes we're able to bring people and engage them to be able to go out themselves and really protect these wonderful wild spaces. Now, understandably, not everyone will have high-end equipment. You don't often need it. Sometimes all you need is your smartphone. But as long as you respect wildlife, as long as you go out there with the aim of helping with our conservation, I highly encourage you to do so, especially because it is a beautiful, beautiful way to get outside. Now, Brooke, I believe we probably have a few questions, so I'm going to toss it back to you. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Well, Anthony, that was so good. Oh my gosh, you had me completely engrossed in that presentation. And even me, as a conservation biologist, you taught me things. So thank you for that. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it as well. So, everyone, we have a little bit of time left for questions. So, in that control panel, throw your questions in there. We'll see how many we can get through till the top of the hour, and we will just dive right on in. All right, Anthony. We have some questions about the whales. That was a
Yeah.
fantastic whale segment you did. Is it known those hybrids that you mentioned, are they able to reproduce or are they sterile? Do you know?
That is a very, very good question. I do not know. I wish I did. The hybrids that we see, It's a new area of study. I was actually talking to a fellow expedition leader who works in La Paz, who mentioned that they have also observed hybrids there. So it is one of the pressing questions, which is it possible for them to mate, to have offspring? What we do know is that there are historical and fossil evidence that potentially between certain species that might be possible. For example, between belugas and narwhal, there have been skulls that have been found with both features of both species. So is it possible for a narluga to exist? Potentially. Hopefully, maybe we'll see one in the St. Lawrence. When it comes to the hybrid between the fin whale and the blue whale, that is one of the burning questions right now. So stay tuned. Hopefully, I will have an answer for you all in the coming weeks, months, years. Who knows? Great question.
Yes, very fascinating. I was hybrids there, just it's such an interesting topic when it happens, a phenomenon
Mhm.
in nature. Um, awesome. Okay, let's continue on here. Is there any theory or theories of how that individual narwhal ended up so far away from home?
Yeah, I've been wondering that question myself for years now. Talking to locals, talking to some of the researchers I was working with when I worked out there, the current going theory, and again, this is to my knowledge, it's very possible that new theories have come out since then, is that this narwhal potentially was separated from its herd in the northern waters of Canada. There is a substantial current that flows from the Arctic, from the Canadian Arctic down towards the south. It's called the Labrador Current. So it's very possible that this narwhal was separated from its herd and just followed the Labrador Current, followed that cold, oxygen, nutrient rich waters right down into the St. Lawrence Gulf. And in the wintertime, that is where the belugas go because, of course, the Saguenay Fjord being freshwater on top, the St. Lawrence River being freshwater, freezes up, and those belugas will go out into the Gulf where it isn't necessarily all iced up. And the current theory, again, is that that narwhal very potentially followed the Labrador Current down to the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, met up with belugas, and somehow they were able to communicate. Because something to keep in mind is that typically speaking, most whale species have a certain frequency that they operate on. So blue whales will have a different frequency than, for example, sperm whales to a certain degree. So it's very interesting to see that this narwhal was able to communicate with belugas. Is it because they have a very similar frequency? Is it just from body language or non-verbal communication? Regardless, what we're seeing is a really interesting phenomenon. I'm not currently sure about how they interact up in the Arctic waters. I haven't found any research about that yet. Hopefully, one day I'll be able to go up there and maybe do my own research study on that. But it is a very interesting question and one that I hope we have an answer to soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Just how cool. How cool that he was adopted like that too into the beluga family. It's a
Absolutely.
beautiful story in nature. This one, you touched on it briefly, but I would also love to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on it. And that is a lot of guests and people who are traveling are asked to turn GPS off of their camera and phones. Could you talk about that a little further about balancing the need for like exact GPS points to help science, especially if it's like an endangered species, but at the same time, if this is an endangered species, we want to make sure that it's protected. So, what are your thoughts on that? How do we balance the exact location with their conservation?
Thank you for asking that question. It's one that is very much a balancing act. In the context of research and conservation, GPS coordinates are vital because very much it shows proof of where these animals are. In the context, of course, of passive and recreational photography, you maybe want to stray away from having that. One of the ways that I do it myself, for example, is because I'm still involved with these conservation organizations. I do have GPS turned on, but what I do is I send those images to the conservation organizations I know and trust, or to the government, for example, and they will use that information. There are ways to change your metadata. I won't get into those right now because it's a lengthy process. However, I do recommend that if people do want to learn more about that, go investigate. YouTube has so many interesting tutorials, or any platform really on the internet, to learn more about metadata, to learn more about how your own images are keeping that information, because you can change it. And I do encourage people to, because sometimes it can be very kind of frustrating to go through your menu when you're in the middle of everything and to turn your GPS off. A lot of people will forget to do it. So what I often recommend is if you're going to publish an image, make sure you double check your metadata. If it has a GPS location on there, just change it, erase it, do something like that. If you're unsure how to do that, again, there are multiple tutorials. So it isn't necessarily a black and white answer because, of course, life isn't always black and white. It very much depends on the context, and it depends on what you're trying to do with your images. If it is to prove a location of a species at risk, of course, GPS location is so vitally important. So it comes down to judgment. It really, really, really does.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. I've run into that a few times online, with my travels around the world, posting rhinos or something like that. You get a lot of feedback in both directions about posting some
Very
of these
much so.
things. So, yeah, it's like, I promise I did the right thing. Um, but awesome. All right, Anthony, we have reached the top of the hour here. So I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Thank you so much, Brooke, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope that at least a small portion of this webinar resonated with you, whether it's jumping onto iNaturalist, jumping onto HappyWell, but more importantly is having fun with it and really thinking about the next time you're out there with your cameras, what is the story you're trying to tell? Because those stories are so vitally important to protecting all of these incredible creatures and so much more. So thank you everybody, and hopefully see you on tour soon.
Yes, Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time to present to us that wonderful, wonderful webinar. And I would like to thank everybody who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. Remember, if you're a part of a photo club and would like a NatHab photo guide to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, please email us at webinars@nathab.com. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.